Have you ever thought you knew everything about someone you loved, only to discover you knew nothing at all? That devastating moment when reality shatters everything you believed to be true? Well, let me tell you about the day I went to mourn my daughter and found my entire world turned upside down in the most unexpected way. It was a Tuesday morning, 3 months after we buried Sarah. 3 months of waking up to an emptiness so profound it felt like my chest had been hollowed out with a spoon. Slowly, painfully. The grief hadn't lessened, not even slightly. If anything, it had grown roots, wrapping around my heart like thorny vines, tightening with each passing day. I remember the weather that morning. How could I forget? It was one of those crisp autumn days where the air smells like earth and dying leaves, where the sun breaks through the clouds in those dramatic rays that make everything look like a painting. Sarah had always loved autumn. She used to collect the prettiest leaves, pressing them between the pages of old books, preserving their beauty like captured moments of fleeting perfection. I drove to the cemetery in silence, the radio off, just the sound of my breathing and the occasional hitch when a sob tried to escape. I had established this routine of visiting her grave every Tuesday and Friday, bringing fresh flowers, talking to her like she could hear me, like she wasn't really gone. My therapist said it was healthy, this ritual, this way of maintaining connection. But what did she know? She'd never lost a daughter. She'd never felt this particular brand of agony that makes you question whether you want to keep breathing at all. The cemetery was quiet as usual, peaceful in that way that only places of eternal rest can be. The groundskeeper, Mr. Henderson, waved at me from across the lawn where he was trimming hedges. He knew me by now, this broken mother who couldn't let go. I waved back, clutching the bouquet of white roses I'd bought from the same florist I always used. White roses were Sarah's favorite. She used to say they represented new beginnings, hope, purity. The irony wasn't lost on me now, bringing symbols of new beginnings to mark an ending so final it had destroyed me. As I walked along the familiar path, my feet knowing the way by heart, I could see Sarah's grave in the distance. Section C, row 7, plot 12. I had those numbers memorized like a prisoner knows their cell, but something was different today. My steps slowed as I noticed figures by her headstone, shapes that shouldn't be there, that had never been there before in all my visits. My heart started pounding, confusion mixing with something that felt almost like anger. This was my time with Sarah, my private moments with my daughter. Who would dare intrude on this sacred space? As I got closer, my confusion deepened into something I couldn't name. There was a man, maybe in his early 30s, kneeling at Sarah's grave. His shoulders were shaking with sobs, the kind of deep, body-racking crying that comes from a place of profound loss. Beside him stood a little boy, couldn't have been more than 4 years old, with dark curly hair and the most enormous brown eyes I'd ever seen. The child's small hand rested on the man's shoulder in a gesture so tender, so knowing beyond his years, that it made my throat tight. They hadn't noticed me yet, too absorbed in their own grief. I stood there frozen, watching this scene that made absolutely no sense. The man was whispering something to the headstone, words I couldn't make out, his hand pressed flat against the cold granite like he was trying to feel her through the stone. The little boy just stared at the grave with an expression that seemed to hold an entire ocean of sadness, a look no child should ever have to wear. My mind was racing, trying to piece together who these people could possibly be. Colleagues from Sarah's work? No, this grief was too raw, too intimate. Family friends I'd somehow never met? Impossible. I knew everyone in Sarah's life, or at least I thought I did. The man looked up suddenly, sensing my presence the way animals sense a predator. Our eyes locked, and I saw my own devastation reflected back at me in his face. He had the look of someone who'd lost everything that mattered, someone who was just going through the motions of being alive. His face was wet with tears, his eyes red and swollen, and there was something in his expression, recognition maybe, or was it guilt? I found my voice, though it came out shakier than I intended, cracking on the edges like thin ice about to break. The words that left my mouth were simple, direct, demanded in a tone that surprised even me with its strength. I needed answers. I needed to understand why these strangers were crying at my daughter's grave like they'd lost someone who belonged to them. Because Sarah belonged to me, she was mine, my baby girl, my only child, the center of my entire universe. I'd carried her for 9 months, felt her first kick, held her through every nightmare, celebrated every triumph, dried every tear. So who were these people? And what right did they have to be here, to share in a grief that should have been mine alone? Have you ever felt that territorial possessiveness over your pain? Like it's the only thing you have left of someone you love and you don't want to share it? Well, that's exactly how I felt in that moment, standing there with my white roses, facing two strangers who were mourning my daughter like they'd known her in ways I couldn't imagine. The man stood up slowly, his movements careful, like he was afraid sudden gestures might shatter whatever fragile moment we were suspended in. He wiped at his face with the back of his hand, a futile gesture since fresh tears kept coming. The little boy moved closer to him, wrapping his small arms around the man's leg, seeking comfort or offering it, maybe both. I could see the man's throat working as he tried to find words, his mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping for air. The silence stretched between us, heavy with unspoken questions and answers I wasn't sure I wanted to hear. My heart was hammering so hard I could feel it in my temples, my fingers, my toes. Something about this felt significant, life-changing, like I was standing on the edge of a cliff and one more step would send me tumbling into an abyss I'd never climb out of. Finally, he spoke, and his voice was rough, destroyed by crying, but there was something familiar in it, something that tugged at a memory I couldn't quite grasp. He said my name, not a question, but a statement, like he knew exactly who I was. That shocked me more than anything. How did this stranger know my name? I'd never seen him before in my life, I was certain of it. I would have remembered a face like his, those eyes that held such depth of feeling, such palpable pain. I demanded to know who he was, my voice rising slightly, panic starting to creep in around the edges of my confusion. The little boy looked up at me with those enormous eyes, and I noticed for the first time that they were hazel, flecked with gold, just like Sarah's had been, just exactly like Sarah's. The resemblance hit me like a physical blow, stealing my breath, making the world tilt on its axis. No, I thought. No, this isn't possible. This can't be what I think it is. But even as I denied it, something in my gut knew. Some mother's instinct that had failed me when Sarah was alive was screaming at me now, telling me to pay attention, to see what was right in front of me. The man's next words came out in a rush, tumbling over each other, desperate and pleading. He told me his name was Daniel, and that he needed to talk to me about Sarah, about things I didn't know, about a part of her life she'd kept hidden. My legs felt weak, like they might give out beneath me, and I had the strange thought that I might just collapse right there among the graves and headstones, adding my body to the cemetery's collection of the broken and buried. I shook my head, denial rising up strong and fierce. There was nothing about Sarah I didn't know, I insisted, my voice sharper now, defensive. I was her mother. I'd raised her alone after her father left when she was just 2 years old. It had been just us, always just us, Sarah and me against the world. We'd been close, so close. Best friends as well as mother and daughter. She told me everything, shared all her secrets, all her dreams, all her fears. Or at least, I'd thought she did. Daniel's expression was a mixture of sympathy and something else, something that looked almost like shame. The little boy continued to stare at me with those eyes that were becoming harder and harder to look at because they were Sarah's eyes. Absolutely Sarah's eyes, staring at me from a face I'd never seen before. My mind was fragmenting, trying to hold on to what I knew to be true while simultaneously trying to process what was unfolding before me. This couldn't be happening. Not on top of everything else. Not when I was barely surviving the loss of her. I didn't have room for more pain, more revelations, more ways to discover that I'd failed as a mother. Daniel took a deep breath, steadying himself, and his hand moved to rest on the little boy's head in a gesture so protective, so parental, that I felt something crack inside my chest. When he spoke again, his words were careful, measured, like he was trying to figure out the gentlest way to detonate a bomb. He told me that he and Sarah had been together for 5 years, that they'd met at a conference in Chicago, that it had been love at first sight, the kind of connection that happens once in a lifetime if you're lucky. 5 years. 5 years of my daughter's life, some of the most important years, her late 20s. And I'd known nothing about this man who stood before me claiming to have loved her. The betrayal cut deep, mixing with my grief and toxic combination. How could she have kept this from me? Why would she hide something so important? So fundamental. Unless there was a reason she couldn't tell me. Unless she thought I wouldn't understand, wouldn't approve. Unless I'd done something to make her feel like she couldn't share this part of her life with me. My thoughts were spiraling. Guilt and hurt and confusion all tangling together until I couldn't separate one emotion from another. But Daniel wasn't finished. And what he said next made everything else fade into insignificance. His hand tightened on the little boy's shoulder, as he looked at me with eyes full of apology and grief, and something that might have been hope. "This is Ethan," he said, his voice breaking on the name. "This is Sarah's son, your grandson." The world stopped. Time stopped. My heart stopped. Everything just ceased to exist except those words echoing in my head like a bell that wouldn't stop ringing. Grandson. Sarah had a child. Sarah had a son. This beautiful little boy with her eyes was hers, was mine, was family I never knew existed. My knees actually did buckle then, and I stumbled, the roses falling from my nerveless fingers, scattering across the grass like white drops of blood. Daniel moved toward me instinctively, reaching out to steady me, but I jerked away, my body rejecting his touch even as my mind struggled to process what he'd told me. It couldn't be true. It simply couldn't be. Sarah would have told me if she was pregnant, if she'd had a baby. We talked on the phone every week. We had lunch together at least once a month when she wasn't traveling for work. How could she possibly have hidden a pregnancy, a birth, a whole child from me? But even as I thought it, I was remembering things. Small details that hadn't made sense at the time. That period about 4 years ago when Sarah had taken a job that required her to be overseas for several months, when our calls had become video chats where I only saw her face, never her whole body. The way she'd seemed different when she came back, softer somehow, more settled, like she'd found some missing piece of herself. The times I'd heard a child's voice in the background during our calls and she'd explained it away as her neighbor's kid or someone at the coffee shop. All those little inconsistencies I'd dismissed because I trusted her, because I never imagined my daughter would lie to me about something so enormous, so life-changing. I looked at the little boy, really looked at him for the first time, and it was like seeing Sarah all over again. Not just the eyes, but the shape of his face, the way his hair curled at the temples, even the way he stood with his weight on one foot, a habit Sarah had from childhood. This was her child. There was no denying it, no matter how much I wanted to reject this reality. My grandson. I had a grandson I'd never met, never held, never knew existed until this moment standing at my daughter's grave. The cruelty of it was almost more than I could bear. Tears were streaming down my face now, hot and fast, and I couldn't tell if I was crying for Sarah or for Ethan or for myself and all the time we'd lost. Daniel was talking again, his words coming faster now, like a dam had broken and he couldn't hold back the flood. He was explaining why they'd kept it secret, though his explanations felt like excuses, like justifications for the inexcusable. Sarah had been afraid of my reaction, he said, afraid I wouldn't accept their relationship because he wasn't what I would have chosen for her. They'd planned to tell me so many times, he insisted, but the timing was never right. And then there was Ethan, and everything became more complicated. They were going to tell me, he swore. Sarah had been working up the courage. She'd wanted to introduce us properly, to have me be part of Ethan's life. But then the accident happened, and she died without ever giving me the chance to know my own grandson, without ever giving me the choice to accept or reject this family she'd built in secret. The anger that rose up in me then was volcanic, erupting from somewhere deep and primal. How dare she, I thought. How dare Sarah make that choice for me, decide what I could or couldn't handle, what I would or wouldn't accept. I'd loved her unconditionally her entire life, supported every decision she'd made, been there for every stumble and triumph. What had I done to make her think I wouldn't love her child, wouldn't embrace this man she'd chosen to build a life with? The injustice of it burned, mixing with my grief until I couldn't tell where one ended and the other began. I wanted to scream, to rage, to demand answers from a daughter who would never be able to give them. Instead, I just stood there, trembling with the force of emotions too big for my body to contain. Staring at this little boy who was looking at me with such cautious hope, it broke something fundamental inside me. Daniel's voice had taken on a pleading quality now, and I realized he was afraid, genuinely afraid that I would reject them, turn away from this child who was all that remained of Sarah in the living world. He was telling me about Ethan, about how smart he was, how he loved dinosaurs and painting and asking endless questions about everything, how he had Sarah's laugh and her stubborn streak and her way of tilting her head when he was thinking hard about something, how much he loved his mother, how he still asked for her every night before bed, still cried for her when he woke up from nightmares. Daniel's voice cracked as he admitted he didn't know how to help his son through this grief, didn't know how to be enough when the person Ethan needed most was gone forever. And in that moment, despite my anger and my hurt and my sense of betrayal, I heard the echo of my own desperation, my own inadequacy in the face of impossible loss. We were the same, Daniel and I, just two people destroyed by loving Sarah, trying to figure out how to keep breathing in a world that no longer made sense without her. I looked at Ethan again, this child I hadn't known existed until 10 minutes ago, and felt something shift inside me, some ancient maternal instinct that transcended my pain. He was so small, so fragile, so heartbreakingly young to understand the permanence of death. And he was Sarah's, made from her body, carrying her DNA, her expressions, her essence. He was the future she would never see, the legacy she'd left behind. How could I turn away from that? How could I let my hurt and anger blind me to this gift, this unexpected grace? My grandson was standing right in front of me, flesh and blood, real and alive and needing love from someone who understood what it meant to lose Sarah. Slowly, moving like I was underwater, I knelt down so I was at Ethan's level, my knees pressing into the damp earth beside Sarah's grave. Up close, the resemblance was even more striking, devastating in its clarity. I could see Sarah in every feature, every expression, and it hurt so much I could barely breathe. But it was also beautiful, miraculous even. This little piece of her that continued, that lived on. My hand reached out almost of its own accord, trembling as it moved toward his face. Ethan didn't flinch, didn't pull away, just stood there with those knowing eyes watching me carefully, waiting to see what I would do. My fingers touched his cheek, soft and warm and real, and a sob broke free from somewhere deep in my chest. He felt solid under my touch, substantial, undeniably present in a way Sarah no longer was. Daniel had stepped back slightly, giving us space for this moment, and I could feel his eyes on us, hopeful and terrified in equal measure. I tried to speak but couldn't get words past the lump in my throat, so instead I just looked at Ethan, really seeing him, acknowledging him, accepting him. His small hand came up to cover mine where it rested against his cheek, and the gesture was so trusting, so open, that it shattered whatever defenses I still had in place. This child didn't know me, had no reason to trust me, and yet here he was accepting my touch, allowing this connection. I thought about all the moments I'd missed, all the firsts I hadn't been there for. His birth, his first steps, his first words, first day of school, first everything. Sarah had experienced all of that without me, had made the choice to exclude me from one of the most significant chapters of her life. The loss of it ached like a physical wound, but I couldn't change the past, couldn't reclaim what was gone. All I could do was decide what happened next, whether I would let bitterness poison this chance, or whether I would embrace what remained. I found my voice finally, though it came out rough and wet with tears, barely above a whisper. I asked Ethan if he knew who I was, even though I was certain he didn't. How could he? Sarah had kept us separated, kept our worlds from ever colliding. But to my shock, he nodded, his little face serious and solemn. He told me in a small voice that his mama had shown him pictures, that she'd talked about Grandma who lived far away, that she'd said someday they would visit, and I would make my special chocolate chip cookies that Mama loved when she was little. The fact that Sarah had told him about me, had planned for us to meet eventually, should have been comforting, but instead it just added another layer of pain. She'd intended to bring us together, had wanted Ethan to know me, but she'd waited too long, been too cautious, too afraid, and now it was too late for so many things. I pulled Ethan into my arms then, unable to resist the need to hold him, to feel this connection to Sarah through this little boy who carried half her genetic code. He came willingly, wrapping his small arms around my neck with a trust that humbled me. He smelled like kid things, like graham crackers and that indefinable scent children have. But underneath it I swore I could detect something familiar, something that reminded me of Sarah when she was small. Maybe I was imagining it, projecting what I wanted to feel. But it didn't matter because in that moment, holding my grandson for the first time, I felt a tiny crack appear in the wall of grief that had been crushing me for 3 months. Not healing exactly, but maybe the beginning of a path toward it. Daniel's hand landed gently on my shoulder, and this time I didn't pull away, too focused on the little boy in my arms to worry about my walls and defenses. There was so much I needed to know, so many questions demanding answers, but they could wait. Right now, this was enough. This simple human contact with a child who was family, who was mine in ways I was just beginning to understand. We stayed like that for a while, the three of us clustered around Sarah's grave, bound together by our love for the woman who lay beneath the earth, connected by grief and genetics, and a future we'd have to figure out how to navigate together. Eventually, Ethan pulled back slightly, looking up at me with those devastating eyes, and asked in a small voice if I was sad because I missed his mama too. The question, so innocent and direct in the way only children can be, broke my heart, and mended it simultaneously. I nodded, unable to speak past the emotion clogging my throat, and told him yes. I missed her very much, more than words could express. He nodded like he understood perfectly, like he knew exactly the size and shape of the hole Sarah had left behind, and told me that it was okay to cry because his daddy said crying helps the sad come out. The wisdom of it, coming from someone so young, made me smile through my tears, and I realized this child had been forced to grow up too fast, had learned lessons about loss and grief that he shouldn't have to know for decades yet. I looked up at Daniel, seeing him with new eyes now, recognizing him as someone who'd loved Sarah, who was raising her child, who was navigating his own devastating grief while trying to be strong for a 4-year-old who needed him. The anger I'd felt earlier hadn't disappeared entirely, but it had been tempered by compassion, by recognition of shared suffering. We were all victims of Sarah's choices, all hurt by her decision to keep secrets, but we were also all that remained of her in this world. We owed it to her memory and to Ethan to figure out how to move forward, how to build something from these broken pieces. Daniel must have seen some of this shift in my expression because his shoulders relaxed slightly, the tension easing from his frame. He suggested quietly that perhaps we could go somewhere and talk, somewhere more appropriate than a cemetery, somewhere Ethan could play while we figured out the details of this impossible situation. I agreed, nodding as I stood up, my hand automatically reaching for Ethan's, needing to maintain that physical connection. The little boy took my hand without hesitation, his small fingers curling around mine with perfect trust, and I felt something inside me settle, some peace clicking into place. As we walked away from Sarah's grave, I glanced back one more time at the white roses I'd dropped, scattered across the grass like fallen stars. I'd come here this morning to mourn my daughter alone, as I'd done every Tuesday for 3 months, and instead I was leaving with a family I never knew I had. The universe had a strange sense of timing, offering me this gift wrapped in tragedy, this new beginning born from an ending so devastating it had nearly destroyed me. I didn't know what came next, didn't know how Daniel and I would navigate the complicated terrain of shared custody and joint grief, didn't know how to be a grandmother to a child I'd just met. But as Ethan swung our joined hands between us, chattering about something with the resilience children possess, I felt the first genuine spark of hope I'd experienced since Sarah's death. Maybe this was her final gift to me. This child who would force me to keep living, to keep loving, to find purpose in a world that had seemed utterly without meaning. Maybe she'd known, somehow, that Ethan would be what saved me, what pulled me back from the edge I'd been teetering on. Or maybe it was all just cosmic chance, random coincidence, meaningless chaos. Either way, I was holding my grandson's hand, and that was something, a thread to hold on to when everything else had unraveled. The drive to the nearest coffee shop was surreal, Daniel's car following mine through the streets that suddenly looked different, like I was seeing them for the first time. Everything felt heightened, colors brighter, sounds sharper, the world more real and more dreamlike simultaneously. I kept checking my rearview mirror, making sure they were still there, half convinced I'd imagined the entire encounter, that grief had finally pushed me over the edge into delusion. But no, there they were, Daniel driving carefully, Ethan strapped into his car seat in the back, both of them real and solid and undeniable. At the coffee shop, we settled into a corner booth, Ethan immediately occupied with the coloring page and crayons the waitress brought. Daniel and I sat across from each other, two strangers bound by love for the same woman, and began the painful process of sharing our pieces of Sarah, comparing the versions we'd each known. He told me about how they'd met at a technology conference where she'd been giving a presentation on cybersecurity. She'd been brilliant, he said, commanding the room with her expertise and her passion, and he'd been captivated immediately. They'd talked for hours after her panel, discovering shared interests and values, a connection that felt destined. Their relationship had developed quickly, intensely, both of them certain they'd found something rare and precious. I listened to him describe a Sarah I recognized but also didn't. A woman who'd been confident in her career in ways she'd never been at home with me, who'd been bold enough to pursue love with someone she'd just met. My Sarah had always been cautious with her heart, careful about relationships, burned by her father's abandonment in ways that had shaped her approach to trust. But apparently with Daniel, she'd been different, open and sure and ready to build a life. When I asked the question that had been burning inside me since his revelation at the cemetery, why they'd kept it secret, Daniel's face crumpled with regret. He explained that it had started simply enough, Sarah wanting to be sure about their relationship before introducing him to her family, not wanting to worry me if it didn't work out. But then she'd gotten pregnant, unplanned but not unwanted, and fear had taken over. She'd been terrified of disappointing me, he said, convinced I'd be upset that she'd gotten pregnant outside of marriage, worried I'd think she was making the same mistakes I'd made with her father. The explanation made me ache because it revealed how little Sarah had understood about my love for her, how much I'd failed to communicate that my love was unconditional, that nothing she could do would make me turn away from her. Had I been so judgmental about my own past that she'd thought I'd judge her the same way? Had my regrets about her father colored her perception of my values so completely that she'd thought a baby out of wedlock would horrify me? The thought that I'd made her feel she couldn't come to me with the biggest news of her life was devastating. A failure of motherhood that I'd have to carry forever. Daniel continued, explaining how the secrecy had snowballed, each month making it harder to come clean, each milestone making the deception deeper. By the time Ethan was born, the lie had taken on a life of its own, too big and complex to unravel easily. They'd convinced themselves they were waiting for the right time. But the right time never came. And then there wasn't time at all. He told me about the accident, details I hadn't known, hadn't wanted to know. Sarah had been driving home from Ethan's preschool graduation when a drunk driver ran a red light, hitting her car broadside. She'd died instantly, no suffering at least, no pain, just there one moment and gone the next. Ethan had been at home with Daniel, waiting for Mama to come back with the celebratory ice cream she'd promised. Instead, police officers had come to the door, and Daniel's world had shattered while he tried to figure out how to tell a 4-year-old that his mother wasn't coming home ever again. I watched Ethan as Daniel talked, this little boy who was coloring with intense concentration, his tongue poking out slightly the way Sarah's used to when she was focused. He seemed okay on the surface, but I could see the shadows in his eyes, the way he'd glance up periodically like he was checking to make sure his daddy was still there, the anxiety of a child who'd learned the hard way that people you love can disappear without warning. My heart broke for him in ways that were different from my grief for Sarah, protective and fierce and determined. This child would not grow up feeling abandoned or unloved if I had anything to say about it. Daniel had been trying to figure out how to contact me, he admitted, scared of my reaction but knowing Ethan needed all the family he could get. He'd been working up the courage to reach out when he'd seen my car at the cemetery, had recognized it from photos Sarah had shown him. Coming to her grave had become part of his routine too, bringing Ethan every week so he could talk to Mama, so the memory of her didn't fade. The fact that we'd both been drawn to the same place at the same time felt like more than coincidence, like Sarah had somehow orchestrated this meeting from wherever she was, forcing us together because she knew we needed each other. I wanted to believe that, wanted to think she was still looking out for us in whatever way the dead can watch over the living. Over the next hours, we traded stories, filling in the gaps of Sarah's life, creating a more complete picture of the woman we'd both loved. I told Daniel about Sarah's childhood, about her obsession with astronomy when she was 10, about the treehouse her grandfather had built that she'd turned into a reading sanctuary, about her terrible singing voice and her talent for baking and her habit of rescuing injured animals. He shared pieces I'd never known, about her work triumphs and her friend groups and her secret passion for terrible reality TV shows she'd been too embarrassed to admit she watched. Together, we built a Sarah that was more three-dimensional than either of our individual memories, richer and more real. And through it all, Ethan listened with the absorption of a child hungry for any scrap of information about his mother, occasionally interjecting with his own memories, simple things like how Mama always sang him the song about the wheels on the bus and how she made funny faces when she fed him vegetables. By the time we left the coffee shop hours later, something had shifted fundamentally. We weren't strangers anymore, Daniel and I, but two people bound by love and loss and a little boy who needed us both. We exchanged numbers, made plans to meet again, started the complicated conversation about how to integrate our lives. It wouldn't be easy, I knew that. There would be legal considerations and emotional landmines and days when the grief threatened to swallow us whole. But there would also be Ethan's laugh and his questions and his presence, a living reminder that Sarah's love hadn't ended with her death, but had created something that would outlast all of us. In the weeks that followed, I became a regular presence in Ethan's life, carefully building a relationship with my grandson, learning his likes and dislikes, his fears and his joys. Daniel and I navigated the awkwardness of our situation with surprising grace, united by our common goal of giving Ethan the most stable, loving life possible. I learned that Daniel was a good father, patient and present and doing his best under impossible circumstances. He learned that I wasn't the judgmental figure Sarah had feared, but someone desperate for connection to the daughter I'd lost. Slowly, painfully, we built a new kind of family from the ruins of the old one. I told Ethan stories about his mother, showed him photos and videos I'd collected over the years, gave him pieces of Sarah he was too young to remember on his own. I taught him to make Sarah's favorite chocolate chip cookies, the ones she'd apparently told him about, and his delight when he tasted them made me cry happy tears for the first time since she'd died. I took him to the park Sarah had loved as a child and pushed him on the same swings she'd once played on, the continuity of it healing something I hadn't known was broken. And at night, when I was alone in my house that no longer felt quite so empty, I would think about that Tuesday morning at the cemetery, about the shock and pain and unexpected gift of discovery. I'd gone to mourn my daughter and found a family I never knew existed, found a reason to keep living when I'd been barely surviving. The tragedy of Sarah's death would never stop hurting. The loss would never fully heal. But alongside the grief now lived something else, something that felt almost like gratitude. I was a grandmother, a role I'd thought I'd never have the chance to fill, connected to a little boy who was teaching me about resilience and hope, and the way love can surprise you in the darkest moments. Sarah had kept secrets, yes, made choices I would never fully understand or forgive, but she'd also given me Ethan, and that was a gift beyond measure. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I'd arrived at the cemetery at a different time, if I'd missed Daniel and Ethan that day, if our paths had never crossed. Would Daniel have eventually reached out? Or would fear and uncertainty have kept us apart? Two halves of Sarah's life never joining, Ethan growing up without knowing his grandmother, me dying without ever meeting my grandson. The thought terrifies me because it feels like we came so close to missing each other, to remaining forever strangers connected only by grief for the same woman. But we didn't miss each other. We found each other in the most unexpected way, brought together by loss but sustained by love. And now, as I watch Ethan grow and change and become more himself every day, I see Sarah in him, but I also see the unique person he's becoming, someone who will carry pieces of his mother forward while also being entirely his own. That's the thing about grief and loss and love, I've learned. They're all tangled up together, inseparable and complicated and beautiful in their pain. You can't have one without the others. Can't love deeply without risking devastating loss. Can't grieve without having first experienced the joy of connection. Sarah is gone. That reality hasn't changed and never will. But she left behind this remarkable child, and through him, she's given me a second chance at family, at purpose, at finding light in the darkness. So if you're watching this and you've experienced loss, if you've felt that crushing grief that makes you question whether you can keep going, I want you to know that sometimes healing comes from the most unexpected places. Sometimes the universe offers you gifts you never knew you needed, connections you never saw coming, reasons to keep breathing when you thought you'd run out of air. Sarah's death nearly destroyed me, but finding Ethan saved me in ways I'm still discovering. And while I would give anything to have my daughter back, to rewind time and prevent that accident, to have one more conversation where I could tell her that my love was unconditional and she never needed to hide anything from me, I can't change the past. All I can do is honor her memory by loving her son with everything I have, by being the grandmother he deserves, by making sure he knows how extraordinary his mother was. Have you ever been through something similar? Have you discovered family you didn't know existed, or found unexpected connections in the midst of grief? I'd love to hear your stories in the comments below because sharing these experiences helps all of us feel less alone in our pain. If this story touched your heart in any way, if it resonated with your own experiences of loss or unexpected joy, please leave a like. It helps others who might need to hear this message find it, and it lets me know that sharing something so personal wasn't in vain. And if you want to hear more stories like this, real experiences of heartbreak and healing, of loss and redemption, of the complicated, beautiful mess that is human connection, please subscribe to Through My Eyes and hit that notification bell so you never miss a new story. These aren't just stories. They're pieces of real lives, real emotions, real people trying to navigate impossible situations. And sometimes just knowing you're not alone in your struggle can make all the difference. Thank you for listening to my story, for witnessing my grief and my hope and my journey toward healing. Thank you for being part of this community where we can share our pain and our joy without judgment, where we can be vulnerable and real and human together. Life is short and unpredictable and sometimes unbearably painful, but it's also full of unexpected grace, surprising connections, and love that persists even in the face of devastating loss. Hold your loved ones close. Tell them you love them. Don't wait for the perfect moment to share your truth because that moment might never come. Learn from my mistakes and Sarah's fear, and choose openness and honesty and connection while you still have the chance. And remember, even in your darkest moments, there might be light waiting just around the corner in a form you never expected.